Hello, I am Reverend Dr. Kwesi Okanta of Royal Priesthood Pentecostal Church, United Kingdom. Tonight's topic is on miscarriage of justice by Mr. David Langwallner, who is a barrister at the 1MCB Chambers in United Kingdom. He is a specialist in criminal defense, immigration, and extradition work. He is also a public and constitutional lawyer and has conducted some of the seminal cases in the history of the Irish Republic. He was the founder of the Irish Innocence Project and the European Innocence Network and was made Lawyer of the Year for achieving the first posthumous pardon in the history of the Irish state in the Harry Grissom case in 2015. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. David Langwallner is a graduate of Trinity College, Dublin, the London School of Economics, and the Harvard Law School. He was a dean of a private law faculty and a lecturer in the Honorable Society of King's Inns in constitutional law and jurisprudence for 16 years. Ladies and gentlemen, presenting to you Mr. David Langwallner.
It's a far too gracious introduction, and I apologize to all and sundry for my book collection. I'm in my basement where I'm exiled, to do the work, and it's comfortable to be surrounded by so many books. And I was on my way home, where I live in Netherlands, pretty much, and I had some very eventful news which affects this talk this evening. I didn't think I could share it, but I will now. The pastor mentioned when I was head of the Irish Innocence Project. I'm still what's called the Emeritus Director. And he also mentioned I set up the European Innocence Network, or was co-founder with Professor Luca Lipari from the University of Milan then and the University of Rome now. But the Innocence Project is a worldwide organization set up in 1993 by Professor Barry Scheck and Peter Nuffel, for American lawyers. And it's kind of morphed into this international organization. There's at least one Innocence Project in every American state. There are Innocence Projects all throughout Europe. Partly I coordinated them by setting up the European Innocence Network. There's an Innocence Project in Ireland, and there are several Innocence Projects in the United Kingdom. And the function of the Innocence Project arose initially in the context of DNA evidence. Barry Scheck and Peter Nuffel around 1993 came as criminal defense lawyers, saw that many people who were lost to the most serious crimes were saying to them, well, we're innocent. And that one thing led to another, and they established that a lot of the problem was to do with DNA. Now, let me come back to that in a second. But the project has shifted and altered substantially. And my involvement was really effectively for about a 10-year period. And in that context, we unearthed in a developmental way many of the causes of miscarriages of justice. In other words, many of the reasons as to why somebody is found guilty of a crime they did not commit. Now, it's a very age-old problem. There have been in human history and recorded human history some very famous people who have been lobbying for what are called miscarriages of justice. Perhaps the earliest, and I'm conscious I'm talking to a Christian group, was an atheist, or at least allegedly an atheist. No one's quite sure. Although, having said that, he had many strong dalliances with religion. And his name was Voltaire, and he was a French philosopher. And he took on board many of the reasons as to why people are falsely convicted. This was several hundred years ago. And then in the late 19th century, there was a French journalist and writer called Émile Zola, very, very famous writer. Some of his books are very famous, such as Thérèse Repin. But he wrote a famous pamphlet, which is available on the net, called J'accuse. And J'accuse means in French, I accuse you. There was front page news all over newspapers, such that Zola, the most famous writer in France, had to leave France and come to England because the French authorities wanted to lock him up. J'accuse was saying to the French authorities that they had framed a man called Dreyfus, who was an officer in France. And it's the most incredible pamphlet. It's very short, very readable. And I used it at one point in time and adopted its structure to accuse other people of corruption. In Britain, above all else, Britain has a seething hatred of people who are wrongfully accused and wrongfully convicted. It's a tribute to the British national character. And throughout the 20th century, there have been many British people. There's been a very famous left-wing journalist now dead called Paul Foot, who launched various campaigns. There was a lord called Lord Longford, who also launched various campaigns. And there is a barrister, much more eminent than me, who's in his
Sorry, sir. Sorry, sir.
How much of that was missed? Because I was unmuted. I was muted there for a while.
Oh, sorry. Come again. Go back again a bit.
Go back where? What did you last hear? I don't know what you last heard. What I was saying, the last thing I was saying before I was muted was that the British, above all else, have been
you're talking about the British and the miscarriage of justice that has.
Yes, Britain has a long tradition of hatred of people who are wrongfully convicted and wrongfully accused. And the examples I was given were the legendary British journalist Paul Foot, a lord called Lord Longford, and then I was about to say, I don't know if you heard this, but there's a barrister much more eminent and much older than me called Michael Mansfield, and he's 83 and he's still practicing. And from the 1970s onwards, him and another barrister called Lord Gifford, who's still alive but is older, and indeed a solicitor called Gareth Pearce, who's still practicing, were responsible for the Birmingham 6, Guildford 4 cases and others, including, of course, I think many of them were involved with the Broadwater Farm incident, and many of them have been involved in the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. I certainly know that Michael Mansfield was. And that is also about issues to deal with miscarriages of justice. But what the Innocence Project since 1993 has done, as Gareth Pearce said when she addressed a conference I hosted in Dublin, was that it has put the concept of innocence and false accusations on a scientific footing. I don't want to get too technical, and I sent the pastor in a PowerPoint, and if we could just pull up page 1 of the PowerPoint now, pastor, if that's possible.
Okay, page 1. Just a second. So he's sharing page 1 of the PowerPoint.
Okay. Page 1 of PowerPoint, switch to page 2. Just why did that one? Why innocent people are guilty. I've said about my involvement with the Innocence Project that I was involved over 10 years, the Irish director, and then what the project was. But the project has saved over hundreds of lives, thousands of lives. Many people who were incarcerated in death row, who stood to be executed in America, have been pardoned as a result of the work of the Innocence Project. And many people have been pardoned worldwide and released from prison. Some after serving prison sentences of 25 years or more. My achievement in the context of the Irish Innocence Project was to achieve what is called the first posthumous pardon in the history of the Irish state. That is myself and a student of mine who's now a lawyer and a solicitor in Dublin, who I'm speaking to today for a variety of reasons, called Tertius von Eden, when he was a student, were responsible for showing ultimately that a man who was executed 70 years ago in the 1940s in Ireland was set up and fit up by the police and local politicians and a whole level of corruption. We proved through the utilization of a gun register and ballistics evidence, enlisting an expert in Boston, and also through an understanding and evaluation of the trial process and transcript about how his trial was a farce and how he was fitted up from day one. And it led to quite a furore in Dublin. Ireland and Dublin's a very malicious place, and we upset more than a few apple carts. There was a documentary made about it, and that led to me being awarded Irish Lawyer of the Year in 2015. Now, it wasn't a singular achievement of the Irish Innocence Project. We also established a right of testing of DNA post-conviction. But leaving all of that aside for a second, the reason this is very fresh in my mind today is that I received a phone call today at about 12 o'clock in the day when I was out getting some clean bands and studs. My studs and bands got rather dirty. That 6 months ago, and it's cost £6 million, the Irish government sanctioned a dig-up of Mountjoy Prison in Dublin, where all the people who were executed were buried. When you're executed, they don't give you a proper grave. They don't allow you a Christian burial in your terms. And the Irish government in January, as an act of reparation and atonement, I think, sanctioned a dig-up to establish above all else to find Harry Gleeson's remains. Now, I found out today, 6 months later, June the 22nd, they found his body, and using DNA techniques, they've established it is his body. And I was in contact with the Gleeson family today, and they have invited me over. Whether I go or not is a different matter. And they have invited me over to Tipperary, where Harry Gleeson comes from, and they've arranged for a private service to collect, privately paid by them, in a coffin, his remains from Mountjoy Prison, and bring them down to his family grave, which is in New Cross in Tipperary, in the next couple of weeks for a burial. And it's hit the... I didn't think I could talk about it this evening, because Kevin Gleeson, his grandnephew, said to me, look, we want to keep this under wraps for a variety of reasons and control it, quite rightly so, but some press outlets in a half-baked sort of way have reported it this evening before I came on air, and so I feel no hesitation in talking about it. And it is kind of like the culmination of many, many years' work. And I think that's an important consideration as well, that it's very, very difficult to prove the unprovable, because once someone is convicted of a crime, the system kind of loses interest. And they stand convicted on the basis of law, and therefore the assumption is that they're guilty. And one of the things that Miscarriage of Justice and Innocence Projects do is try and reinvent the wheel to establish, well, they were wrongly convicted in the first place. And that leads us, I think, to the most important point, which is what goes wrong. And that's largely in the next slide, Pastor. So if we could move to that.
Yeah. Hold on a second. The next slide. Have you put it on?
Yeah, no, we're there now. Now, I don't want to be technical, and everybody can ask questions later, but I'll try and outline over the next 40 minutes or 30 minutes or so, what are the causes of what causes someone to be wrongfully convicted. Now, if we go back to the man I mentioned, one of the great experts in miscarriage of justice, the legendary French philosopher Voltaire, he's full of very famous sayings. And one of his most famous, and he's written some very famous books, but one of his most famous sayings is, people believe, in effect, what they want to believe. And this is a concept that a lot of philosophers and writers have spoken about. It is what's called cognitive or confirmatory bias. And in most of my jury speeches as a defense advocate, I warn juries about it. If we could just look like cognitive bias, first of all. Cognitive bias is jumping to a conclusion, basically. We're all human beings. We are all prejudiced to a certain degree. We're all products of our life experience. So we're all inclined to judge people. I can't see any of the people I'm talking to, They might be judging me for all sorts of reasons. I don't know. They may be making an assessment of me or a profile of me. I simply don't know. We're all inclined to judge people. The problem, of course, is that people who are often specialists and trained in a specific way adopt a form of tunnel vision. And it's particularly true in certain instances of police officers, social workers. They assume if someone is accused of something that they're guilty. But it is not simply a question of police processes. It's also a question of prejudices of people in the jury box. For example, the legendary American legal philosopher Jerome Frank, who I've written about, he says very famous quotes. But he says, and he's written some wonderful books, including Law and the Modern Mind. He says that in the context of a jury, jurors have human prejudice. They may not like the sound of someone's voice. They might not like the sound of they might like someone's appearance. They may not. They have prejudices against people based on the color of their skin, on their ethnicity, on their sex, whatever. In those circumstances, people are liable to jump to conclusions, particularly in certain types of cases. And certain types of cases create an overwhelmingly prejudicial effect. It is very difficult, for example, when the indictment is read out in a criminal case, when the Crown opens speech in a sex case, and the jury just look at the person in the dock, the accused, as if he's guilty. Horns coming out of his head. They look at me as if I have horns coming out of my head. So people are liable to jump to conclusions. And one of the things I say in the jury speech is don't. Don't if you possibly can. Confirmatory bias is slightly more complicated, and it's very disturbing. It's about science and forensics, really. Most people think, and the Innocence Project was set up dealing with DNA. I don't want to lumber you with technical data, but the Innocence Project showed that there were more sophisticated DNA tests, such as what's called a mitochondrial test, which were able to more clinically establish whether somebody was or was not the guilty person. And there's a huge literature on this, and there are articles I've written or contributed to. But we'll be here all night explaining it, and I'm happy to share those articles if anybody wants them. But in the context of DNA testing, one of the central figures in the Innocence Project is Dr. Greg Hampikian. He's not a lawyer, he's a scientist. And I've worked with him in a case in Greece, which there is a film made about called In Doubt, which is on the net. And you see my ugly face, and he's far from ugly face. And Dr. Hampikian has written an article, a very important article, with Dr. Itiel Dror, who's a professor in Imperial College in London, about confirmatory bias. And it arises in the context of DNA. Now, it's startling. Somebody is positively matched as a definitive individual who caused the crime. The police go to their DNA people and say, we believe he did it. He's the suspect. And the DNA people identify him. What happens is Dr. Dror and Dr. Hampikian took the same sample, the sample that was tested, and they gave it to 17 independent experts, and they said nothing. That means they didn't say to them whether someone did it or didn't do it. They just gave them the sample. And the results were remarkable. There's only a paper that's come out in the last number of years. Of the 17 independent experts, 13, that is 13 out of 17, found no match, no DNA match. And only one of the 17, or two, doubtfully potentially, were prepared to say there was a positive match. Now that's huge disparity. Why? Well, we're assuming that the DNA found or state experts were not corrupt. It's simply this. Because they were told it's the suspect, they're inclined to find the person. And that's called confirmatory bias. And it's one of the most disturbing and unsettling things in the criminal justice system, because it undermines, in a way, even the whole question of how good a DNA test is. There are other problems with DNA that the Innocence Project apart from the fact that DNA testing was out of date and they had to be more sophisticated testing, and apart from this concept of confirmatory bias, it depends on how degraded the sample is, where the sample is found. It also depends on police crime scene investigation. Say they even find DNA. Have they looked for anybody else's DNA? Have they tested a sample on clothing or on articles of furniture for someone else's DNA? Did they conduct a DNA test in the first place? All of these are fundamental problems in the justice system where there is a suggestion that somebody else may be responsible. Another issue is what's called false confessions. Now, everybody believes in the justice system, if somebody goes into an interview with the police and says, I did it, well, that should be the end of it. Or that they say in a text or an email, I did it. Now, sometimes we can argue about language and whether it's clear cut somebody did it or not. But there is a phenomenon the Innocence Project has identified of false confessions. Say you're a very vulnerable adult with learning disabilities. You're inclined to think sometimes very short term. So you might say, I want to leave this oppressive police environment. I want to go down the pub. I want to have a drink. I'll be released from bail anyway. I'll just tell them what they want to hear. It's a feature of adults, it's a feature of children, it's a feature of all sorts of vulnerable people or people in positions of inequality of bargaining power. And it's, again, a very disturbing aspect of the justice system. I'll say more about the police in a second, but I just want to flag in the context of cognitive bias, without being critical of police officers, we're all technical. Some people say about me as a defence lawyer. I believe everyone says. The amount of times I've been told I believe any cock and bull story. And I suppose it's true of any position you occupy in this life, that you have an inclination to look at things in a particular way. I try to develop in the criminal justice what the Innocence Project calls, in which they've trained me to think in terms of what if thinking, which I don't think police officers and social workers often do. And you see it in the interviews they conduct all the time. They assume someone's guilty. What if thinking is there's possibility A, someone's guilty, and there's possibility B, they're not guilty. And the allegations are made up or there are other reasons. In this context, something very disturbing is what's called false memory syndrome. Now, there's a massive discussion going on about it. I suppose at this stage, at one level, I'm one of the principal advocates of it, although I'm not a scientist. The principal people are two American academics who are not lawyers, but very brilliant people, one of whom I know, Elizabeth Loftus and Maggie Brooke. And they've shown that particularly in manipulable people, and that means particularly in children, by a pattern of reinforcement and asking leading questions, and asking them persistent questions over a period of time by a parental figure, an authority figure, a police officer, a social worker, or a parent, the child will say, quote a recent book, a day a social worker slaughtered rabbits, which is, now I'm not taking that out of the top of my head. That's a quotation by a man called Stanley Schiff in a recent book, which was based on the Salem witch hunts. And it shows that the concept of miscarriage of justice is of long vintage. The Salem trials were when people were put on trial in the 16th century for being witches. And if you torture someone, you ask them persistent questions, you bully them, well, they'll create a memory. Their memory will be subject to what you have dealt with them by way of a pattern of reinforcement. And that was one of the problems they identified in the historic witch hunts of the 16th century. And it's always there for a caution that the questions that you ask of anybody in any session, whether it's a barrister or police officer, should not be oppressive and should not lead them to giving an answer not that they want to give, but you want to give. And nor should you engage in, and there are all sorts of people who fiddle with people's memories, at least the CIA have conducted studies of this, of ways of getting people to have false records, deliberately or not. Is the case. So false memory syndrome, which is accepted in many jurisdictions in America, but is held with a certain degree of skepticism in Britain, is still, I think, a hugely important reason for miscarriages of justice. Let's move to the next slide.
Yes. Oh no, go.
Well, there's a neat lead on there. There's a thing called leading questions. Now, I've written quite a lot about and other issues, some of them to deal with what advocacy is about, what being a barrister in a courtroom is about. And I tend, as I get older, and I'm 59 now, I tend to be much more reflective of both the ethics and the morality of what I do as a barrister. And which is not to say I don't fall into sin in the Christian sense of the term. And the big sin of a police officer and a social worker, or indeed a barrister, is a leading question. A leading question is a question you ask to elicit a response you want by, in effect, putting words in the witness's mouth. Now, it is not something that is prohibited in cross-examination, but it can be something that you fall into the trap of, as I've done, in examination in chief. And that means you're eliciting a response in a way that you have carefully crafted the response you want. And that can be very dangerous. There is also the question of police misconduct. I have found in my professional experience, comparing Britain to Ireland, that the British police, and this may be an amateur's judgment based on professional experience, are inclined to be much more honest and much less corrupt. I don't think I would be inclined to accept an Irish police officer's word about almost anything at this stage. They're so institutionally corrupt. And the British police, I think, from my experience, don't go around all of the time fitting people up or framing people, or a lot of the time. They tend to often, but that is not to say that in any police force around the world, they're rotten apples or people who target. I don't think it's as prevalent a phenomenon, despite the crisis inquiries in Britain, as it is in other jurisdictions. But often, of course, criminality is not located in the police. The police are the enforcers of often very corrupt state interests, governmental officials, and so on. And in third world countries, particularly, countries where there is not a clear demarcation of the separation of powers and roles and institutions, there's a very strong tendency of police officers to be told by governmental officials, judges, and ministers what to do. Certainly, it's something I've seen in Ireland. Witch hunts, I've mentioned, I mean, in the context of Salem, but they're modern day witch hunts. They're political prosecution. People who are prosecuted for political reasons. And there are also, and that has been a feature of the last 50 years and 40 years, and it's getting increasingly more the case. Recently, the Italian Prime Minister, Miss Meloni, prosecuted the legendary Italian anti-corruption journalist Roberto Sivioni because he called her, for her policy in immigration, a bastard. And she prosecuted him for causing her offence. It's ludicrous. Now, he was convicted, but the judge did not send him to prison, which leads to another thing, which I'll deal with later, that whether it's a question of miscarriage of justice or not, is a question of how sometimes certain laws should not be laws. But in Britain, a phenomenon I have known also about witch hunts is vigilante groups, often very religious, sometimes very Irish, targeting often men on chat lines, pretending to be somebody younger. Now, I profoundly disapprove of this, and then they give a file to the police. That is not to say I don't profoundly disapprove of people who engage in that type of activity, of talking or soliciting younger people. I do. But I don't think that the rule of law and processes should be run by vigilante groups. The other thing is a trial process is a finite process. Lawyers are human beings. The amount of things I have to think about on a daily basis in a case get to court in time, have your computer ready, have what you worked on last night, work out a sequence, change the sequence in accordance with what happens in the court before you go to court. And things get missed. Human error. Not corruption, not non-disclosure by the Crown, not fabrication, not lies, but it's a finite process. It's a beginning, a middle, and end. And defense lawyers and prosecution lawyers make mistakes. And it's very, I appeared before a wonderful judge who I met in a garden party in the Iceberg Grand Court recently. I don't mind mentioning HH. And he devoted such tolerance to the case, I won't mention the name of the case, that there could be no misunderstanding that every stone was unturned. The problem becomes when resources, time, mistakes lead to what's called conceptual closure. We have to bring an end to this. And sometimes that's not. Next slide. Wrong place, wrong time. Very close person involved in the Innocence Project was locked up for 20 years. She's now got a house in the west coast of Ireland. And that's because she got into the wrong company, in the wrong car, at the wrong place and time. And she was falsely accused of being a murderer or involved in murder. I mean, it shows one should be cautious in terms of one's daily activities and one's regulation of who you associate and why you associate with people. And the prevention is often better than cure. And therefore, it is a good idea to be careful about where you are, at what time of night you're at a certain place, and who's around you. It sounds simple, but people do jump to conclusions. Laws and ass. Within the UK criminal justice system, the Blairite reforms of Tony Blair went far too far in what's called bad character. No one quite understands this. For example, in Ireland, you can't bring someone's bad character in unless they bring it in themselves. In Britain, you can, and that includes such things as a propensity to commit a crime. That means a tendency to do so. And it's not just a question of the Blairite reforms of the admission of offences which show that propensity. It's often a case as well of showing not just convictions, but chat lines or text messages. And the danger with this is convicting someone on the basis they've done something inappropriate, which led to no charge, on the basis that they're guilty of the very serious offence that they are charged with. In my view, it's the confusion of morality with legality. And whether, since people have different moral viewpoints, I think it's extremely dangerous, the extent and ambit of the bad character admissions in this country. The more dirt you sling, the more it's likely to stick. I'm not saying bad character shouldn't be admitted in the English courtroom, but only in very limited circumstances. One problem the English courts do deal with, well, is identification. In this day and age of technological surveillance, CCTV cameras, and so forth, you can get accurate looks. And there's a thing called RV Turnbull, which is a decision in the 1970s, which establishes fleeting glances, careful judicial warnings in the trial process. But if you know someone, where you saw them from, what time of day it was, what time of night it was, are you sure it is the person you see? And identification evidence can be a problem, as can within the structure of the British system. And it's there in the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, and it's there also in the Guildford case, Guildford pub bombings, racial or ethnic profiling. It's a disturbing feature of our day and age that we're turning into a very tribalistic, often racist age, and an exclusion and demonization of minorities based on their ethnicity, the color of their skin, where they come from. And it's a dangerous assumption that people jump to conclusions based on somebody being in a particular place at a particular time, based on the color of their skin or their ethnicity or the sound of their voice. And that is also a significant cause of miscarriages of justice. I've said over many years to the Innocence Project when I was involved, I'm still the emeritus director of the Irish Project, but that rather than getting, as the American Innocence Project does, somebody out 25 years later and having a big photo opportunity, the Americans also have sophisticated compensation schemes for what they call exonerees. That means people who have been released from prison. The state, the Americans say, tends to look after them, but they've been in prison for 25 years. And I gave a paper in the University of Milan, which is published in Cure, and I've given it in Britain, in University of Sussex, and I've given it in Ireland, various places as well, and I've given it to American University of Cincinnati and other places. That it's far better to improve standards at the inception of the process. Rather than somebody serving 20 or 15 years, why don't we go back to base zero, improve professional standards techniques at the beginning so that the mistakes don't happen insofar as we can. And in that sense, I was trying to spread the message when I was involved in this project. Now, I've tried to spread it with the police force in Britain, but there are no takers yet, that lawyers who believe in miscarriages of justice aren't necessarily to be disliked or despised. They're not anti-police or fighting the system as such. What they're trying to do is improve standards for everyone within the system. And the best way of improving standards is improving standards at police investigation, at techniques before charge, techniques of interview, and arguments about whether a case should be dropped or not, and at the trial itself. But ideally, well before the trial. I've given jury speeches, which has led to acquittal, saying, I don't believe this person should even be charged. We shouldn't be here. And so the Innocence Project and these scientific insights and ideas, Gareth Pierce very graciously said, have been put in scientific project, are a way of learning, a way of erudition, and a way of improving the quality of the service we provide. And they should be almost like an educational manual for prosecutors, defense lawyers, and so on. I mean, one thing that really troubles me is that in the new dark age that we're entering, people don't read anymore. They don't read in detail. They don't read in an interdisciplinary way. They're not educated. They're not reflective about what they do and why they do it. And I think the Innocence Project is an organization whose ideas have evolved since 1993, and the cause of miscarriage of justice have organically developed, been understood. And there should be a cross-fertilization between the discipline of law, the discipline of science, the discipline of psychology, so that we understand what goes wrong with a view to improving clinical practice from the get-go of the system. And I've been very much a lobbyist. I try myself to introduce it as much as possible in the way I conduct proceedings. But we're in very challenging times. We're in a new dark age for all sorts of reasons. Where there's economic close to meltdown, COVID created a disaster, there's congestion in the court system. And with the best will in the world, sometimes we're all human beings. We all make mistakes. But it's always better to aspire to be better.